Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm hoping you all can hear me right now. We have an amazing presentation today coming from ZS, and without any further ado, I will turn it over to them to give self-introductions and begin going on their presentation.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Can everyone see me?
I can see you.
Okay. I guess I'll have to take your word for it for the rest of the audience. But welcome, everyone. Unfortunate that I can't see all of you, but let's get started. So thank you so much. Let me introduce the two colleagues who will be working with me as we bring you the discussion here. And I will share my presentation. Hopefully you can see that. What we wanted to do today was really talk about the intersection of two very important areas, AI, which this conference is all about, and life sciences, which is where all of us work. Quick introductions. I head up a couple of different things at ZS. I head up the pharmaceutical vertical, hence life science, and then I also head up the artificial intelligence track. We call it the advanced data science track. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about the intersection of these two areas. Along with me, I have Omer Hancer, who's also a principal with me at ZS, and he has been working on the application of AI in one of these areas, the world of the customer, and he'll go through some of the learnings and impact he has seen. And we are delighted to also welcome a client, Anita Moser, who heads up assets and optimization for US Neurology at UCB, which is a pharma company. And we'll have a discussion with Anita later in the discussion, in the presentation, on some of the challenges she's seen and how she's overcome that in the context of actually working through an AI capability at a company like UCB. So that's really the agenda. What are the things we want to cover today? I think broadly speaking, we're talking about the promise, the pitfalls, and the path forward. So rather than spending a lot of time on a couple of specific problems, what we wanted to do was pull back and sort of draw the long view, the high level picture. Where is this industry when it comes to application in AI, of AI to the various problems it has? It's been a bit of a laggard, frankly, compared to some of the other sectors, but there's a richness of data and there's a lot of potential here. So we wanted to walk through what the industry is investing in, where some of these successes are, where are the sort of high areas of investment and interest, but then also where are the areas of return. And where we will look at two worlds, the world of the customer, which is much more of an external facing view for pharma, and the world of the product, which is a fairly complex and expensive process in this particular industry, and how AI is helping there as well. So those are the two sides of the coin in some sense. But then we want to get into some of the pitfalls, things that are actually stopping us, that are perhaps enabling us. What are the key dimensions you need to create that capability? How do you make AI work? Not this problem or that problem, but as an overall capability. And then finally, we'll end with some ideas, suggestions for the path forward. So why AI now? If you talk to chief executives in pharma, about 70% of them think that AI is a very high priority for them, among some other things as well, of course. But it's sort of finally come to this industry. Why is that? I think three reasons. One, the business problems that pharma has worried about have changed dramatically in the last 5 years. What are some of the new problems? 5 years, 10 years ago, pharma's entire approach to the customer was very much a push approach, a promotion driven approach, a directive approach. But I think what's happened over the last 5, 6 years is that the physician customer has actually taken much more control into their hands. And as a result, pharma has to be much more customer centric. We have to figure out what the customer's needs are. We have to predict them. We have to anticipate them. We have to plan for them. The second piece is that the world of the product got a lot more expensive. The amount of money that pharma has to invest to get the next sort of product to the market to launch is now about $2.6 billion. That number has been doubling every 9.5 years. That means that 5 years, 10 years ago, this was not such a big problem. But now we are at the cusp of the R&D ROI becoming 0%, break even for the industry as a whole. So it's a serious thing that we have to fix. Can AI help? The second piece is there's a lot of data in pharma and in healthcare in general. So the volume has never been an issue, but increasingly the variety has become an issue. There is so much data. One company I know has 800,000 data sets in its data lake. So the lake is there, the water is there, but who is going to make a good drink out of it? Where is the insight going to come from? Can AI help? And the third piece is that now there is a path. Fast followership is possible. We don't have to invent everything from scratch. There are many other industries and companies outside pharma, outside healthcare that are doing a lot of good work. And simply adapting and applying it in a clever way will actually help us. So fast followership is possible, but what is the best way to do that? So let's look at the sort of the life sciences value, all the things that we do as an industry. The first two rectangles, drug discovery, clinical trials, and pipeline, are actually, just to give you a sense, about 15 to 20% of revenue in terms of the size. So it's a fairly big number. And like I said, it's for every launched molecule, there's $2.6 billion of cost sitting behind that. So as you can imagine, that is one of the first places AI went to. We actually asked about 26 different companies, large and medium-sized life sciences companies, to say, where are you investing in AI right now? And these were their answers from a survey that we did very recently. So you can see the great majority is really on the left side together. Marketing, which is what happens after the product has been approved. So it spends about 8.5 years in the first two rectangles and about 10 to 12 years in the next two rectangles. And that happens later, of course, in the molecule's life. And AI is beginning to get applied there. There is a common area called real world evidence, where using a lot of actual data outside the clinical trial phase in the real world is actually helping both the commercial side and the R&D side. We'll look at some examples of that later. But this is just to give you a sense of where things are right now. In manufacturing, which is about a quarter of revenue as well for the industry, it has about a quarter of the AI investments. So you can begin to see, roughly speaking, where pharma and life sciences in general have placed their bets. The question, of course, is let's go down one level deeper and see what exactly are the problems they are solving. First, the world of the customer. The essence of this is the idea that, let's start with the physician customer, by the way. For pharma, there are two types of customers, physicians and patients. And apologies to those in the audience who know some of the industry context, but I'm trying to explain the problem broadly to the healthcare audience. The world of the customer. Now, there's about 1 million physicians in the US, and pharma, of course, goes to them. But like I said before, the push marketing has become so extreme that for a high value physician in the US, pharma can bombard them something like 2,800 times a year as an industry, by the way. So, all those reps, all those emails, all those pushes, the pop up alerts. If I count up all of them, I'm creating as an industry a really lousy customer experience. And so the twist here in terms of the AI application is not just finding the customers, it's really anticipating their need. What would they prefer? What is actually their need in terms of information? Because they're not actually buying anything in the usual sense, but they do need information about the products of the industry. So how should we engage them as an industry? And then, of course, some of the tactical details like when, because if I'm going to do a lot of things, the cadence becomes important. And so there's a central problem here in the world of the customer, the physician customer, is can I anticipate the customer needs at the individual level? Because there may be two physicians, half a block apart, same specialty, that work very differently, that think about different things, that have different questions. So can I personalize the way I approach them? And you heard about personalization in a couple of other contexts earlier today in retail. How can I take some of those ideas but apply them appropriately at this level to solve for the 4 C's: the right customer, the right channel, the right content, and the right cadence? So that, in essence, is a big part of the problem. And 5-6 years ago, this problem really wasn't there. So this is very much a new problem, but a very important one. And I will now call upon my colleague, Omer Hancer, to talk through a case of how exactly would you solve this? And is it worth it? What kind of impact and learnings would we see? Omer, over to you.
Thank you, Pratap. So I hope everyone can see me and hear me. So Pratap pointed out that the busiest prescribers, the highest value prescribers in the US, are receiving somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,800 touchpoints from pharma over the course of the year. That's essentially 8 to 9 touchpoints every single day of the year solicitations from pharma, and that's become extremely difficult to manage from a healthcare provider's perspective, and that's to Pratap's point, a lousy experience that the customers are having. That's why we really need to shift the focus and put the customer at the center of this equation, and that's where next best action framework comes into play. So this is a framework that leverages AI and machine learning techniques to effectively personalize, optimize, and harmonize the entire marketing and sales journey around the specific customer based on their individual needs. It aims to accomplish multiple objectives. One is to match to the channel and content preferences. During COVID, as a physician, do I like to engage in person, face-to-face with the sales representatives or not? Perhaps I prefer Viva Engage touchpoints. Am I open to mobile alerts through the apps that I have on my mobile device? Am I open to third-party email, pharma email? All these interactions, these attempted touch points need to be triggered not when pharma is ready to push these out, but when the customer is likely to be receptive to those touch points, when they actually need to and want to engage with those touch points. So it needs to be triggered at the right time. The entire omni-channel ecosystem needs to be coordinated appropriately. That captures the entire non-personal promotion side of the equation, as well as the personal promotion and other non-promotional touchpoints as well. The customer-facing organization is much broader than just sales representatives. It encompasses medical science liaisons, thought leader liaisons, nurse educators, business reimbursements managers, and other roles as well. We need to be able to enable a continuous learning through the human channel, so the recommendations that this type of an approach provides to the customer-facing organization, do they actually resonate with the sales folks and medical science liaisons and other roles that cover their account or their customer? Does the insight make sense? Does the action make sense? But at the same time, as the customer is at the center of this equation, we need to learn from the engagement and sales behavior of the customer as well. All of the engagement patterns and sales patterns need to feed back into the process to enable this continuous learning. And finally, especially on the sales side, everything needs to be tailored based on the needs and the circumstances and contextual drivers of a particular geography around a particular customer, to personalize and enrich that conversation that the customer-facing organization would have with that physician at that point in time based on the needs of that customer. The entire spectrum needs to be enabled through advanced analytics, technology, and change management. I'm sure there are many in the audience who are interested in understanding, going a little bit under the hood and understanding how this works. So next best action consists of multiple components, and many of these AI and machine learning techniques that our team refined and adapted to pharmaceutical industry are also leveraged across multiple industries. I'll share some examples over here of 4 different processes or algorithms that work in conjunction in harmony. The first step is what we call the customer engagement index and affinity prediction. Customer engagement index is a composite index that captures the breadth of engagement across channels, the depth of engagement for any given channel, and also the consistency of engagement over time of a particular customer. Affinity is a preference towards a certain content or channel. So we actually leverage the similar algorithms to what Netflix leverages in terms of collaborative filtering. And we've developed a deep collaborative filtering version of that algorithm. And one advantage we have over Netflix is that we know a lot more about the healthcare providers and prescribers than Netflix does about their subscribers in terms of movie choices that might resonate with their subscribers. We're able to predict with a high degree of accuracy whether a specific content piece to which a customer has never been exposed, whether that would resonate with that customer or not. The second step is to evaluate the sequences that lead to particular sales behaviors and estimating with a high degree of accuracy what the resulting sales or engagement behavior would be if I were to choose to expose a customer to a specific touch point, a content and channel combination with appropriate timing between those touch points as well. We recognize those patterns and estimate the predicted behavior of the customer as a function of exposure. And that's very, very similar to the deep neural network algorithms, image recognition algorithms that Facebook uses, Instagram, Google Photos, Apple iPhoto, etc. In the digital industry. The third step is to generate a series of sequences. And in order to do that, we use the genetic algorithm which many stock traders in NASDAQ are leveraging for their buy and sell decisions. We generate a series of populations of sequences through mutations and crossovers, and essentially evaluate those against a set of predefined constraints to make sure that we're meeting the strategic and budgetary and operational constraints imposed by the brand and marketing operations and sales teams, and craft journeys that are much more likely to engage the customers over time and lead to higher sales results. And finally, most AI and machine learning implementations have some degree of domain expertise or expert triggers embedded in the process. No matter how good the machine is or the algorithm is, it may not be able to predict the appropriate course of action or determine the appropriate course of action to especially rare market events, for instance, the entrance of a new competitor product in the market, or a new piece of clinical information becoming available on the marketing side that the machine may not be aware of. So certain pieces are fed into the process as constraints so that the engine can optimize around those specific set of constraints every other touch point that happens across the omnichannel ecosystem. We recognize and we learn the behavior, the patterns that lead to better versus worse engagement by studying the historical exposure of the customers to these content and channel pieces over time, and then we craft new journeys that are much more likely to yield significantly better engagement and ultimately sales results. So it all sounds great in theory, but does this work in real life? So let's take a look at an actual implementation as well. So I'll talk about a large pharmaceutical organization where the fully AI ML driven omnichannel set of next best actions have already been enabled across multiple franchises and multiple countries as well. I'll specifically focus on one of those mature franchises and their journey along the way. So the next best action implementations look and feel like analytically heavy implementations, which is a true statement. You can see that the AI and decision engine and algorithms are at the heart of this kind of an implementation. However, each program has many pieces of the puzzle, many components to bring this kind of capability to life and drive success for the organization, from digital analytics to field integration and marketing integration as well, content and metadata tagging and management, to upstream and downstream data and platform integration with multiple data warehouses, Viva CRM platform, Viva Vault, Salesforce Marketing Cloud, and several third-party vendors that essentially deploy some of these attempted touch points. Everything needs to be enabled through a strong change management program, which I'll talk about in a second. So this particular program went live in early 2019, and let's fast forward 6-7 months and let's look at the outcomes that came from this particular program. The next best action and AI recommended visits for the sales representatives were 50% more effective than standard organic calls that the reps would have made otherwise in any case. And the engagement levels improved significantly with the customers, around 30% improvement in overall digital engagement levels, despite fewer attempted pushes from pharma, which is great because, going back to Pratap's point, around 2,800 touch points, and we can reduce the number of attempted touch points, yet drive a higher engagement in absolute terms and in percentage terms as well. That's a wonderful outcome for the physicians too. They're being exposed to fewer touch points, but they're much more relevant and much more timely based on their needs. And that also leads to a significant sales lift as well. 35% sales lift, impactable sales lift was observed in this particular implementation. Just as importantly, a few key lessons that we've learned. This is truly a cross-functional team effort. Yes, it has multiple components that will be led by the insights and analytics and advanced data science groups. That's wonderful. But there are many additional functional teams that play a very critical role throughout the process. For instance, the customer engagement or customer experience groups, marketing operations, sales operations, and Salesforce effectiveness, field champions, certain district managers who are also involved in the program, training, and certainly business technology, and IT, as well as brand and marketing teams. So it takes a little bit of a village to bring this capability to life and drive this level of continued and sustained success over time. Generally, an agile approach works well and aiming for a very good results that are not necessarily perfect. And we don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. With a strong change management program that speaks to the needs of individual stakeholders, from the representatives all the way to the internal, marketing folks. What's in it for me, and why do I need to adopt this new way of working, and all the way down to third-party vendors as well who need to adapt to this new way of working. In earlier years of these implementations, the third-party processes were much more challenging, because not only do they need to provide data from an upstream integration perspective, but they also need to be able to act upon the recommendations on a daily or weekly basis coming from an AI and decision engine, and that wasn't a trivial process for third parties. Now, many of them, especially the larger ones, are much more easily able to adapt to the recommendations to be deployed on a daily or weekly basis. And also, if we think about the capabilities that this enables, so I mentioned this is a 2019 program, so we had no way of knowing that COVID was in the horizon at that point in time as we built the capability. It enabled very rapid response to unexpected market dynamics and circumstances. This particular organization was able to dial up or down certain channel and content pieces within days, not weeks, within days after COVID-19 stay-at-home announcements. And they were able to adapt their content pieces shortly thereafter as well, and drove over a 50% improvement in engagement rates during the COVID period. And finally, a healthy degree of skepticism is expected around whether or not this kind of an approach would work with a large, mature sales force and a large, mature brand with low promotional sensitivity. And it was clear to the organization that it is indeed possible to create significant sales impact even with mature brands with low promotional sensitivity. Thank you. Pratap, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Omer. Okay. So we just went through the world of the customer, one aspect of the customer. But of course, the key customer for pharma has always been the patient, eventually. Though pharma is at an arm's length. So I think part of the challenge here for the industry has been the patient health outcome is the central problem. But I think as a result of privacy restrictions and the fact that the providers and the payers are a very integral part of taking care of the patient, and pharma is a couple of steps away, so to speak, it becomes a challenging for pharma to apply AI in the world of the patient. But how might that happen? So again, we've collected a few examples, probably 8 or 10 of the more popular use cases. The intent here is not to be exhaustive, of course, but just to see some sort of broad patterns, right, without going into too much detail on the individual bullets. First, if you lay out the journey of the patient, it's very useful to think about, if I'm going to create a medicine in a therapy area that I'm entering as a pharma company, where can I add value? Of course, we create the medicine. But after inventing the medicine, you still have to solve a lot of problems, because the patient has to get diagnosed, they have to originate, they have to get the right diagnosis, the right treatment, and then they have to stay on therapy, which is a huge challenge. So just to give you a sense of what the business challenges are here, if I'm a rare disease company, and there are 7,000 rare diseases, finding the right patient to get on my disease, to get the right diagnosis, to even know that this medicine actually is the appropriate one for them, is a challenge. It takes 7 years and 8 misdiagnoses before you get the right diagnosis as a patient. So think about the sort of broader healthcare problem, right? Can AI help figure out who these likely patients are likely to be? Where might they be? What kind of characteristics might they have? Because that will help the patient get a faster diagnosis. It'll help the physicians who don't have to go through all these iterations. And of course, it will help eventually the life science company as well. So that becomes a key problem in the diagnosis, treatment selection sort of part of the spectrum here, the second and third column. I'm just giving you a few examples. A second example that you begin to see is on the other side. So after the prescription is written, it's perfect, everything is good. The patient has the prescription, but of course, 30% of the time, 30 to 50% of the time, they basically do not complete the course of therapy. Partly it's an access issue, partly it's not been fulfilled, partly they fall off compliance after 2 or 3 months. And it's a huge, huge loss to the healthcare system, and of course, detriment of the patient as well. So it's a broader healthcare problem. And one of the challenges, because it is about the pharmaceutical drug, is pharma is now increasingly and enthusiastically applying AI to the problem of, can I predict when the patient falls off therapy, and why is that? Because falling off after 45 days and falling off after 6 months are totally different phenomena. So I have to get down into the detail and look at the drivers, and there could be 50 drivers that may be possible. Which ones work at what step for what kind of patient? That's a detailed problem. Humans were not very good at it. That's why it was a $300 billion unsolved problem for the industry adherence. But now we're beginning to make inroads because we can predict the patient, we can predict the reasons, and more importantly, AI is giving us the insight to say, if that's the prediction and this is the reason, what can I do about it? So that's the other lesson, I think, and Omer talked about it, that the AI approaches can't just stop at insight or prediction. They have to carry forward all the way to action, because that intervention is really at the micro level, whether it be physician or patient, makes a big difference. And so that is, I think, one of the maturation of AI in healthcare, in life sciences, about really getting to driving the action and not just stopping at the prediction. And you can see the impact here. Couple of things you'll see in terms of AI applications in this domain. They tend to cluster around the treatment decision, but not on it. And as you can imagine, that has still been a struggle, which is to come up with an algorithm that says this is the right treatment or the right medication for the patient is not something it shouldn't. It needs the full cooperation and partnership of providers, payers, and other data. And in fact, when we did some independent research, which I won't talk about today, about physician attitudes, about AI being kind of a colleague or an advisor, I think we are a long ways away from that. And so the search is really about what is it that AI can do that is a good recommendation or a suggestion, so that AI and the human, the doctor in this case, can actually come together on the right recommendation. So it is not a replacement, it is an enhancement. And those are the areas where the adoption has worked. And a case in point, just to give you an example again, in the patient domain. And this is actually a real world data domain, which actually helps with both the clinical trials part and the post launch part. This was in NASH, liver disease, basically. And the idea here was that how do you identify NASH patients? NASH is quite prevalent and very underdiagnosed. Of course, you can confirm it with a liver biopsy, but you don't want to get to that point, both for the expense and the inconvenience for every single patient where you might suspect it. So what you need is an intelligent screener which can make that prediction happen. And so, as you can imagine, this is a very, very deep domain-related model. So it's not as easy as just putting a bunch of data together. We had to do a lot of literature review and medical interviews to even understand what the right risk factors are. Of course, most healthcare organizations have that resource. But then the question becomes, how do you put together the different data sources to come up with something like 200 to 300 features, and picking the right features that then go into a model, which I won't talk a lot about. I think the audience here would understand that sort of the stalwart modeling approaches, right? XGBoost, neural networks. We had to try 3 or 4 things. That's another lesson. You have to try 4 things before something really works well. And so there is a high probability of failure, at least initially, with a lot of these ideas. But eventually we got to a point where 80% accuracy was achieved. And the reason I want to bring out this example is a couple of things. One is that it emphasized the importance of using real world data, which is quite incomplete. I think there was a question around bias in the data in the chat, I think from Ivan, and what that means, like what data sources do you have to think about. And I think across all of these, the bias, the incompleteness is very strong. So just to give you a sense, in oncology, data completeness is 15 to 20% when it comes to claims data. 15 to 20%. On the other hand, that's more than enough for AI to start making reasonable extrapolations. So data is woefully incomplete. It has to be patched together across different data sources, hence the problem of variety I talked about. And that degrades the data even more and more. But I think the mindset here is, if the data is stupider, the algorithm has to be smarter, right? So the AI is compensating for that in many ways, rather than trying to become very perfect with good data. And the way that this is used, of course, it was used for increasing the speed of trial enrollment, because rather than putting everybody who could potentially go in the trial through a liver biopsy, which is a very, very high patient burden, you could actually come up with the screening to augment an existing process, augment an existing human decision. And of course, on the flip side, it also helps to create the right awareness and screening for patients when the drug is approved, because you can go through something that is simply about information collection and not about an invasive procedure. You do that only when you're pretty confident the procedure is going to be positive. And because this is a highly regulated industry, it is important for AI to come up with where are the elements where I can interlock with a human decision and stay within the protocols of regulation. Now, regulation is changing. The FDA is evolving, but as we all know, that's a relatively slow process. And so we have to make sure that we can enhance human decision making within the context of that constraint. The world of the product has actually very similar issues. In the interest of time, I won't spend a ton of time on this, because I did want to emphasize, as you've seen, maybe disproportionately, that even though most of the industry is spending its AI investments in this area, in the world of the product, with discovery, with R&D, which is all good because it's an important problem to solve, I think they have under-indexed a little bit on some of the short-term horizon impact that Omer and I talked about earlier with the physician and the patient. So in the commercial world, is it possible to get and see impact with some of the decisions we talked about within a 2-year window, a 2 to 3 year window? Because many of the things that we want to change on the clinical trial and the drug discovery side are either some things that have to fit within, of course, the regulation, but also fit within a very long time horizon. Remember the 8.5 years it takes to go from inception to potential approval. And so that's a longer horizon. And so when you think about a portfolio of cases, you have to kind of make bets in both areas as opposed to mostly bets in one side of the basket, if you will. What are some of the problems that we see here? So the big problem is the clinical trial, right? So drug discovery is an important issue. In fact, 1/3 of all AI investment in healthcare is going into drug discovery, but a lot of that is actually happening outside the walls of the big pharma company with startups, with companies like Benevolent AI, with In Vitro, In Silico, and there's hundreds of them. They're doing a lot of the innovation which pharma is importing, which is great. But within the walls, again, the sort of focus of this particular discussion is actually the clinical trial design area, where, like I said before, 37% of clinical trial sites don't recruit all the patients they're supposed to. 11% of them don't recruit a single patient, 0. The question is, why were they planned that way? Can we use AI to predict, if I planned a trial a particular way, how many people would I recruit? Would they complete the trial? What's happening with this ongoing site? Can I intervene sooner? So think of it as a huge problem in complex logistics to improve the efficiency of the decision making so that I can reduce both the cost and the time. And if I can save 20% of the cost of the $2.6 billion, that is extremely, extremely substantial. And so we see a number of areas emerging here around clinical trial design and planning and optimization, which of course are built on the AI prediction of, if I make this particular trial happen, how will it pan out? Both in terms of the design, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, but also finding the right patient cohorts, but then of course going city by city, country by country, globally, where should I put these sites? And then of course, how can I intervene once the trial gets going? With virtual trials, which is one of the results of COVID, this area has sort of kicked into high gear because obviously patients drop out, and they've dropped out even more. And as trials are resuming, this sort of 1 in 3 loss that we see, patients who have been recruited basically don't complete the trial. That's another area where you want to be able to predict and intervene. It's very much like the compliance issue, patients dropping off, but in this case, the trial. So you can begin to see some of the parallels, that if you can actually hone the approaches, the methods, some of the data, some of the behavioral aspect of what a human does as opposed to the clinical aspect, can you actually use your leverage your learnings from the R&D side to commercial, or vice versa, so that you can actually bring these two pieces a little bit closer together. They do tend to operate in silos in a pharma company, at least as far as AI is concerned. So that was the other thought. With that, let me pause here. See, are there any questions, Omer, in the chat that we should address, just so that we can maybe change the cadence a little bit? And then I want to quickly get to Anita as well.
Yeah, you've already addressed Ivan's question, so there are no additional questions, Pratap, right now on chat.
Okay, great. But so far, we've talked about the promise. So what are the pitfalls? Why doesn't AI work? Why can't we use AI to solve all these problems? Obviously, Omer referred to some of these challenges. And in fact, when we did the survey, I'm going to skip the poll for now. Um, but if you have any thoughts about key pitfalls you see, please put them in the chat from your viewpoint, from in your organization. We asked all these executives, right? These 26 companies that we surveyed, where will it have the biggest impact in the future? And you can begin to see sort of the balance turning. Rather than heavily indexing on the left, I think now there's a much more even balance on both the drug discovery and clinical side, but also a focus on saying, look, we went to all this trouble to create this product. Let's make sure that it does get appropriately used. How do we do that better? The other aspect is pharma competition has increased significantly, even in areas like oncology, which was once sort of low competition. Now there's 1,000 molecules in the pipeline. So you can begin to see this is great for the consumer and for the patient and for healthcare in general, but everything is becoming much more of a niche game. And once that happens, whether it's rare, whether it's oncology, whether it's the indications in cancer, whether it's cell and gene therapy, it becomes a matter of fitting the treatment to the individual patient. And so there's a lot of focus on this sort of thinking on the right side increasingly. But there are barriers. What has stopped us? At a high level, there's been a couple of interesting developments. About 3 years ago, if we had done this poll, and we did, all the focus was on the tech and the data. Oh, the technology is not there. It takes forever. The data is in very bad shape. Yes, we have prescriptions data and claims data, but what do we do beyond that? How do we get to behavior? So in general, what we are finding is that technology as a barrier, the infrastructure, has receded. Pharma has made some reasonable inroads. I mean, I'm sure there are issues for sure, but it's no longer the main barrier. Data is an issue, as you can see the things there. Inaccessible data, data protection. Let me make this a little bigger so that's easier. It's a little bit about data, but the big shift is to the left. We can't find the right people. We can't get them to turn data into actionable insights. There's a lot of resistance to change, whether it's middle management who have to actually use that data to make the decisions, or top management's resistance to sort of sponsoring this. So even though there is good agreement at the highest levels, at the 70% CEO buy-in, there is some ways to go in the middle. It's getting better, right? 14% top management resistance to change is not a huge barrier. But I think more and more, it's become about getting the right people, getting the right operating model, and getting the sort of softer side of this to have adoption and impact, and less more of the technical issues around data and technology. So that shift is a very interesting one in terms of where sort of the tide has shifted in terms of the things that we need to deal with. So with that, let me actually stop sharing and introduce Anita. So welcome, Anita. Thank you once again for joining us. I just wanted to introduce you very quickly. As I said before, Anita leads up a very interesting combination. I mean, UCB as a company, as a pharma company, is actually doing great strides in terms of AI use, both on the world of the customer we talked about and the world of the product. And Anita, as you can see from her title, sort of spans both in some ways because of some of the creative software products like the Eliprio platform that UCB is creating in epilepsy. But first of all, thank you for joining us. And maybe I can ask you to give some quick background on some of the work that you're overseeing at UCB and your role, and then we can get into the questions.
Great. Thank you, Pratap. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Pratap, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, technology has not been my friend today, so I'm hoping this works. Again, Anita Moser, Head of Assets and Optimization for U.S. Neurology at UCB. Very excited to be here, and thank you, ZS, for the invitation. You've been a great partner. So Pratap's right. My role, we've done a lot of innovation. Innovation is part of our core at UCB, and we have strong leadership behind us on our digital transformation, as well as we index high on digital here, and so we have a lot of investments that have been involved on kind of the predictive part of the pathway in epilepsy. And so we lead a lot of different innovative partnerships and investments, and The one we will speak today happens to impact, kind of the commercial organization, which.
Daniel, are you able to hear Anita?
We can't hear Anita.
I'm still here. I cannot hear Anita, but I can hear both of you.
Hey, Anita, I think we have a problem with your sound. It sort of went in and out a little bit. Oops. Okay, apologies for that. I think we're trying to figure out how to get her back. We can see her video moving, but I can't hear her.
Hi.
Yes.
Much
better. Much better. Thank you. I think we lost you a little bit. Daniel, can you just put Anita up on the screen so that it's easier for folks to see her? She's doing most of the talking right now.
Definitely. Anita, when you take it away and begin speaking, you should come up here.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone.
Great. Thank you. So I think you were just mentioning a little bit about your role, but sounds like you've had some success. So I think I just wanted to maybe start with a question around a lot of the folks in the audience are AI champions within their organization. I think that's kind of the role you find yourself in. What are some nuggets that you would share, some pearls of wisdom on being an AI champion in a company? What made that happen for you? What was secret to success in some sense?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned people. I think in our world, you're trying to change workflow with AI, and you really need to understand the change management involved with the introduction of AI into their work and understand how to impact it to build champions. So that's definitely one big learning for us, is the people component of it all. I think the second is kind of an interesting one in the sense that we are, you're building for the majority for sure, but you have to make sure you're learning for the minority. And in this case, learning from the minority helps you understand how you'll innovate and change and garner further adoption in the future, which I think is really critical. So that's another piece of nugget. And then I think the other huge piece of nugget for us was understanding how much the organization has to shift in terms of your operational backbone from the beginning. Because as I mentioned, UCB is very innovative. It's part of its DNA. We have a huge digital agenda. So finding advocacy at this company relative to my past has been unique and refreshing. However, understanding how much of your operational functions have to move along with you has been a huge learning for us at UCB.
That's a very interesting phrase you use. Learn from the minority to build for the majority. I think it sort of perfectly encapsulates AI's challenge that you do the small thing and then you have to really build scale. How have you been successful at scaling? So going from the minority to the majority.
Yeah, I mean, we think very big, but we start small, right? And it's been consistent feedback for us, right? So, and I think that vision is really what makes it successful, and the fact that it helps, the vision helps bring the organization on board and helps bring our leadership on board. And then starting small helps us learn. So we didn't go right in a lot of our initiatives. We often do a proof of concept and test. We learn about what we're trying to introduce, and we learn how, again, it changes the behavior of people to then pilot, to build, to launch. So we use a very gated approach, and we do have a culture of innovation and agility that helps us pivot quickly and learn in this whole environment of testing and learning and, you know, iterating through that process so that we're able to adapt for our outcomes.
Got it. And actually, you pointed out another really nice nugget there, which is I think you used that in a conversation previously with me, that the pilot is also about testing the behavior of people. It's not just about testing the model, right? Which is,
Yeah.
I think, really important, because what you're trying to do in the pilot is figure out not just does the model work, but do the people work with the model, right?
Exactly.
So will they change how they do?
Exactly. We, a lot of our epilepsy business, we've been fortunate in the sense that we have a leadership position in epilepsy. So a lot of our colleagues have been with us for some time. So when we introduced an AI-enabled tool to the field, the first proof of concept wasn't about the features of the application. It wasn't about the benefit. It was a very small proof of concept. It truly was about how they adopted the tool. That's it. So I think that's really important for us, because we took that learning and created a learning plan and a communication plan for the bigger rollout.
Right. And you had also mentioned that one of the sort of guiding principles that really made this successful was simplicity.
Yes.
Whereas we in AI, we practitioners tend to think of complexity. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, what's so fascinating is that a lot of our analytics are very complex here, and they're complex because we're all very curious here, and we are looking to stay ahead, and we have very interesting questions, as well as we have a portfolio and a interesting go-to-market model as well. And with that, we know that our analytics is much more advanced. Not all of our people are as advanced as our analytics, and that you have to, again, think about the minority versus the majority. So if I look at applications like Waze or Netflix, it's very simple for someone to get. And it's very easy to introduce all of the analytics to someone at once. But unless their appetite for digesting analytics is comparable, you have to make sure you do it in a very gated way. And I think that took time and effort to learn, right? But it's really the co-creation that helped us understand that, which is what we spoke about earlier, which is this proof of concept and piloting, is that everything we've introduced has been a co-creation with our field colleagues. And so they are being guided by experts in analytics, but they're helping co-create what their vision is, which also helps with adoption.
Absolutely. No, that's actually very key to change management. It has to be a bit of a 60-40 or a 50-50 partnership. Going back broadly to your remit and your role, now that you've been on the AI journey for a little bit, and clearly you've seen these successes, what are the couple of things you wish you knew now, you wish you knew before, that you know now, in terms
so
of
so much. I think one of it is the fact that the operationalization of AI tools and the embedment of a commercial organization is complex. So understanding the roadmap and the complexity of the integration of newer tools into existing systems is probably something I underscored at the beginning of all this. We got caught up in the innovation that we forgot about the operationalization and further advancement of this in the future. It can be mitigated, but it's something I wish I put a little more planning into as we thought about this. I think one of the other things is also, we spoke about, building for the majority and learning for the minority. If I had understood how much of what level of resistance in the organization I was planning for, there would be an easier way to help bring along the entire organization as we introduce different things. So I think understanding the level of resistance and the motivators for the resistance is important, as well as I think I brought up the operational backbone. That is critical to success. Understanding what it's going to take from not only introducing new technology, advanced analytics, but elevating your digital backbone is really quite important to scope out from the beginning.
Got it. And of course, we can't let the day go by without talking about COVID. This pandemic I have seen in many places sort of freeze up innovation and special projects. But I think you guys took advantage of this to continue to innovate. Tell us a little bit more about the impact.
Yeah, we did. So we were on this path with dynamic targeting. We had done a proof of concept. We had done a proof of concept. We had pilots that were ready to roll out. And then the pandemic hit, and it was unfortunate because we had a beautifully laid out plan of doing pilots, creating adoption, creating champions, and doing further rollouts. And what we realized was that we had to hit pause a little bit, and we had to reevaluate: do we further invest and roll out, or do we pause? And then it became easy that it became an easy transition. Well, especially my role, to think, okay, here are our investments. How do we pivot? And if we really thought about it, our field colleagues that were so used to interacting with our stakeholders in the external environment were no longer able to, and they were disconnected from people they saw every day, and they had impact on patient lives every day. And so what we decided was to do a full-scale rollout and adapt the algorithms for COVID and help use this tool as a reentry tool for our field colleagues to connect them back with their stakeholders. And because, as we all know, the US was impacted by COVID at various levels. And so not every market is returning at the same pace. So this tool allows them to understand when HCPs are back to seeing their patients and helping fill a gap in healthcare for that particular practice that exists that they normally would not know about until they actually connected with that HCP. So this allows them to prioritize which HCPs to re-enter back with in their markets a lot more readily than the cold call or happening to find out by chance.
Right. No, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all these insights. Will this set you up for future disruptions in a better way, you feel?
Oh my God, yes, right. So this is just the beginning. Now we're looking on expanding into Omni and introducing new channels. And I should say our model has 3 different customer-facing teams that this tool allows to coordinate interactions with the HCP. Because the HCP is pretty exhausted from the experience that they're having with healthcare and treating their patients during this time of COVID. And we had to coordinate interactions between our teams to help better support the HCP and ultimately patients. So expanding on our ability to help them understand what's going on in their markets, as well as introducing new channels to this tool, will really help us. And I think, one other point of advice I could give to someone is that at UCB, we lagged on the analytics and we were very advanced in the technology. And now we have the inverse, right? Where our analytics are so advanced and the technology is catching up. So finding that right balance is quite fascinating for us.
That's great. Thank you so much. Are there any questions for Anita from the audience? If so, you can always type them in the chat. Omer, I can't see the chat, but perhaps if there are questions, you can ask some.
No new questions that I've seen.
Hey, Pratap. So I actually have a few questions I'd love to kick it off with, if that's okay with you.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, great. So we all hear about AI's challenges in explainability and trust for adoption. So in terms of the models that you talked about, how well do these models do on these dimensions in pharma in terms of challenges and explainability? Do you find that it's a barrier or not as much?
It is always a barrier. Like Anita said, which I think is something that we should all take away, which is the pilot is not about figuring out if the model works. It's whether the people work with it, right? And so what are the barriers there? Well, I don't understand what it is. It's a black box. Explainability is really, really important. The second piece, of course, is that they actually have to trust it. So even if they can see what it's doing, the trust involves making sure that your data sources are not biased and the model has been tested every which way. Clearly, there was a question around that earlier. So that has to be addressed. So in the life sciences and healthcare, that is doubly important. So when it comes to things like patient care, obviously the bar is very high. And so it's not just about accuracy, it is about explainability. But I do want to point out that's another area where you have to make the right trade-off. So if it's outside the clinical area in pharma, meaning deciding whether to have a clinical trial in the city or not, right? That's not a clinical decision. It's in the sense of a medical outcome. It's a logistical decision, which is, will we have enough patients in a particular place? in order to have a site there? Or on the flip side, will this physician be open to receiving emails on topic X? And so what we find is that people still hold the higher bar. Oh, this has to be, p-value 0.05. Otherwise, I won't believe it. And the point is that these are business decisions where the p-value can be lower. You can go with 70, 80% accuracy and yet actually see a big dollar impact. So I think those are the things you have to trade off in pharma, which is, of course, reliability is important. But beyond believability, beyond explainability, beyond trust, you also have to make sure that you're doing the right trade-off with that metric around reliability and accuracy. So let me do one thing, Daniel. I do want to finish up on a couple of slides, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions. But first of all, I did want to thank you, Anita, for sharing your wisdom. I think that was really, I can see in the chat many many accolades for people heartily agreeing with you and echoing your point of view. So thank you once again for the Q&A. I think I'm going to switch back to a couple of things. I just want to hit 2 slides. 2 or 3 slides just to finish up in the last 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have some room for questions as well. I did want to give people a sense of where is the industry when it comes to these enablers, right? We've been talking about where are they investing? Is it R&D? Is it commercial? Is it manufacturing? What success have they had? But these are the 6 things that stop or enable, depending on your point of view, in pharma. So we benchmarked about a dozen companies in life sciences just to give you a sense of where are things. And of course, I'd love for each of you to look at this picture and say, in your mind, where is my company? So organizational mindset, we talked a lot about. I think generally the life science industry is doing quite well. Most of them actually are in the 3rd bucket along the top, sort of basic, foundational, advanced, and transformational, with a couple doing very well.
Pratap, a quick point. The slides are not showing up right this moment. If you can try to project one more time.
That is a very good point. I don't know why that's not showing up, but let me do this. Can you see now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. You can see it now, right?
Yes, we can see it. Yep.
Okay. So what I was talking about is these are the 6 dimensions of progress in terms of organizational mindset and so on. Mindset, the industry is good. These are the 12 to 15 companies we benchmarked by going through sort of assessing them one by one. Couple very much in the lead, but in general, the industry is in good shape. Like I said before, technical infrastructures moved along. It was more between basic and foundational before. Now it's getting into the advanced category for most companies. A couple are very, very far ahead with their data lakes and things like that. So technology, I know, can still be a bit of a challenge. And like Anita said, in this case, the analytics has moved ahead of the technology, which is good. But technology has generally been solved. Data, reasonable shape, some lingering challenges. The 2 big challenges are operating model and people. And you can see there, those are the 2 dimensions that are sort of the most behind on this scale. And of course, we talked about that earlier in the survey as well, that people were really struggling to find the right skills. So I want to maybe spend a minute on those 2 issues, operating model and people. What are the pitfalls? What can we do? I think one issue with the operating model is that we almost, in many cases, we collect a bunch of people and then we say we just want them to solve problems. Let's get a bunch of data scientists and get them to solve problems. That is the hard part, but it is by far not the entire problem. What we have found successful in terms of an operating model is almost to apply pharma's own model of molecules to AI. What do I mean by that? Start with 60 cases, right? Identify a pipeline. It's like going into phase 1 trials. Do some very quick filtering. Lots of different areas, different use cases. Some have been very poorly formulated. Some are very unstructured. What is the value? What is the feasibility? Who will actually adopt this if it works? Don't worry about whether it will work or not. If it works, whose life will it change? Is that person willing to stand up? If you have 60 of these cases, then you go into experiment mode and you say, let's come up with essentially the equivalent of the phase 1 trial. Let's spend 3 days on each problem, no more. So we have these 72-hour hackathons when nobody sleeps. Here's the data. Here's 3 days. What's the best you can do? Do something very quick, very dirty, And if you can't get to 40 or 50%, throw the problem out, right? So you have to really winnow down this thing to do this experiment to say, will this work? And in that second step, then you have to take a few problems. So from 60, maybe 10 go into the hackathon, 5 come out as very promising, do a detailed proof of concept for 3-4 months to get that accuracy up from 60% to 80% or whatever it needs to be. Then do the pilot. And so to me, the proof of concept is different from the pilot. And Anita said this again, the pilot is not just to make sure the model works, that's where the proof of concept comes in, but the pilot is to make sure the people, the business process, the decisions work around the model. Because if you don't change that, that is usually the biggest problem why things will absolutely never scale, even though the math is absolutely right and you've got a wonderful model. And so when you go from the model to scaling, from the minority to the majority, what are some of the things you want to keep in mind? Simplicity, that was brought up in terms of scaling. All the operational processes where this solution needs to connect. Omer also talked about that. AI is at the heart, but you need the rest of the body. The heart alone will not do anything. And so those are some of the scaling lessons that you have to do. And remember, it will not be very encouraging. You start with 60. By the time you get to scale, there'll be 1 or 2 problems that are ready to scale, that you can scale, which will have that impact of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, or lots and lots of new patients and things like that. So that is really the sort of ratio math that you have to keep in mind. But you have to keep this pipeline going. When some of your team is off experimenting and scaling, what are the next 30 problems coming in the pipeline? So you have to keep renewing, and that is really the only way to keep an operating model going at full pace with a group of people. And speaking of the group of people, I do want to hit this issue of shortage. I think many companies have gone the route of, let's hire a bunch of data scientists and give them interesting problems to solve. Now what? It turns out, and again, Anita pointed this out, which is that when you go throughout the whole process, experiment, develop the model, but then you have to operationalize it, deploy it at scale, and you have to do lifecycle management. COVID happens, the algorithms have to be changed. The model has to be retrained with new data. Additional features have to be created. It's never the model. Like Omer said, there were 4 different models that we had to string together. So there's a lot of deployment and management stuff that data scientists don't have to do. In fact, they don't want to do it. That's part of the reason why it's been so difficult to scale. And in the first part, in the experimentation, like I said, a lot of domain expertise and data knowledge is needed. That is not always in the skill set of the classic data scientist or the AI researcher. So what people have been more successful in doing is creating this village with at least 4 to 5 different roles. The data scientist, the domain expertise, sort of the business domain person, like a business consultant, who's analytics savvy, but is not an AI person. And then the data engineers, the AI ML engineers, to create something that is technically feasible and scalable that runs. And then the automation, the refreshing, the updating of the model, periodic enhancements, the AI ML admins. And I think if you diversify this people ask into these 4 or 5, it's much easier to create that community and to have them work together, rather than asking for a full stack data scientist that can do everything, which is, I think, been the ask for many of our clients, and that's been a struggle. So to finish off, I think 3 things in terms of takeaways. I think we talked about a lot of different things. Hopefully you got some value out of the discussion. But 3 reminders. 1, keep that pipeline approach in mind that I talked about, right? Lots of ideas, proof of concept and experimentation, and then scaling. But keep the balance in the pipeline. I think with regard to the long-term return and the short-term returns, and the balance between revenue, effectiveness versus costs, efficiencies, restore the balance more towards the commercial versus the R&D side. Both are important problems, but I think it's really important and valuable to have quicker, clearer impact on some short horizon problems while you plan for the more difficult long horizon ones. So in your pipeline, if you write down all the things you're working on and you want to be working on every 6 months, what is the balance, the portfolio balance that you're maintaining with regard to these criteria? The returns, the risks, the horizons, the commercial versus R&D versus manufacturing balance, the revenue impact versus the cost, etc. So keep that scoreboard and keep it balanced. The second, as we have said, we should not go too much for full stack data scientists all the time. scaling and operationalizing anything beyond the proof of concept does require different skills. So make sure you have these different skills together, because you do need the operating model to work cross-functionally across them as well. And then the last bit, I think this is especially true for pharma. I think many folks say, you know what, I want to be the first one because this will be a competitive advantage. But I think for AI groups, it's important to remember that you're still proving value within the broader company, which is a legacy business, right? It's not like the high-tech companies where AI and digital is everything from day one. And so fast before first. Import the knowledge like the folks in discovery are doing, or work with vendors like Anita mentioned to say, can you get impact in quickly and show that impact within the, with high speed, because that impact then gives you the leeway, creates the runway where you can actually achieve leadership over the long run. There you can be first. But if you try to be first before you're fast, I think you lose competitive advantage. In fact, the example that Omer shared, one company had solved that problem 2-3 years before the example that Omer gave, but they hadn't scaled quickly because they wanted to sort of do it all by themselves. And some of these barriers we talked about got in the way. Whereas the second company came up much later, but was a very fast follower and then scaled up well beyond the first one in terms of countries, brands, and such, and the impact. So now they have the budget, they have the investment to really establish their leadership in some other areas. So those are some takeaways and some ideas for you as you go forward in your organizations. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. We do have time for a couple of questions. So if there are some on the chat, we can do that, or we can turn to some of the questions you had, Daniel.
All right. See me? Can you hear and see me, Pratap?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Something I noticed from your slides is you do talk about change management in terms of barriers to implementing AI solutions. But for an organization that is struggling with that right now, is there anything you would say to them in terms of getting executive buy-in or rolling out an effective change management program?
Yeah. So I think, again, as I think all three of us have iterated again and again, I think the best way to create, to convert people to do the change management aspects is to do a couple of things. First, what's in it for them in a very, very clear way, for middle management, for people in the field, for marketing teams, for the people who make the trial site decisions. How will this actually help their life as opposed to threaten their way of working? So I think really working through the WIFM and the change process and co-creating with them, Anita referred to this as well, is really the key piece for change management. There's no real alternative to it. You can educate, you can train, you can evangelize, but you really have to sit down and co-create. That is one. The second is, if you show the impact, I think a lot of people are much more open to trying new things, because part of the problem here is this stuff is risky. It doesn't always work. So it's not like classic analytics where we know what to do. We just choose not to do it sometimes. But here we may try to do it. And like I said, you start with 60 cases and maybe at the end of 1 year, you have only 2 successes to show. So I think you have to really set expectations. That's a key part of change management as well. I know we are reaching towards the end of time. So maybe let me just pause here and wrap up. And thanks everyone. And of course, thank you, Omer, and thank you, Anita, once again for sharing the stage here and having a great discussion. Hope all you guys in the audience found it useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, if you are tuned into this, go do some networking, stick around. We have some great opportunities over the next few days. And I want to give a really warm welcome, virtual applause for ZS and Anita and everyone else who's here. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Daniel.